Welcome to the Lift Ed podcast. My name is Erick and I'm joined by my co-host, Scott McKean. We are recording in the basement studio of the Edmonton Community Foundation, who has generously donated the space to us, and as our host let us in on her day off. So thank you, Community Foundation.
That was really nice, yeah. And thanks, Erick. On today's podcast, we get to meet someone who is a blast from my past. Peter Smyth and I were at Grant MacEwan College together in the early 1980s studying journalism. Many of us from that class went into newspaper or broadcast careers, but Peter kind of fell off the radar. Turns out he had another passion in mind, which we will talk about today.
So what happened after journalism school, or what pushed you onto a different path?
Yeah, I was young enough when I had finished journalism. I was 20 at the time. Was doing some volunteer work with the Youth Emergency Shelter at that time, and enjoyed doing that, and figured I had time on my side, so I was able to return to school. I wanted to return to school and follow a path in social work, which had been kind of part of my family, and wanted to continue doing the volunteer work and then make that into more of a career, with the goal, because I wanted to combine writing and social work. So being able to do that, so it's worked out well.
So while I was partying at MacEwan College, you were volunteering. And what was it for you to go into volunteering? There was something then about your early life that led you to that. And what was it?
Yeah, both my parents, when we grew up in a household where they were volunteering, both of them, in numerous organizations. This was in Wales, and then when we came to Canada when I was 12, and they picked it up here as well and got involved. They felt a sense of responsibility of being active in the community, giving back to the community, and it was a very, very natural thing for us to do. And the youth area even then had piqued my interest, so started with the Youth Emergency Shelter, which is my first volunteer gig.
And you wouldn't have been much older, right, than the kids at the Youth Emergency Shelter at the time, because you're 18 to 20 or something in those years.
Yeah, that's true. It was learned a lot quickly, and good people around to support me in that. But it was a good experience, and so with that, continue then down the path to going into social work. 32
years of children's services.
Yeah.
And I wanted to see if we could start off this way. Can you, we see problems on the street. We read about it or hear about it. But I don't think the layman has a good understanding of how big an issue it is at risk or high risk youth, the population that you would have been dealing with in those 32 years. Is it big and broad? Is it 100 of these kids in a city of 1 million like Edmonton, or can you say?
Yes, I would say probably a few hundred, and we separate out because I was involved in the High Risk Youth Initiative with the Government of Alberta Children's Services in the Edmonton region, and there was a lot of youth having struggled. So under the Hard to Serve umbrella, there was the at-risk population, and then there was the high-risk youth population. So the at-risk would be more, they have vulnerabilities, they could go down the wrong path, they're probably experimenting, possibly with weed or drugs, but they have enough protective factors that with a bit of support or over time, they would kind of figure things out, work through them. And then there's the high-risk youth population, which is a population we refer to as a disconnected. So these were youth that didn't have those protective factors. They didn't have family. They didn't have key people in their lives. They didn't have that coach or that person from the church or somebody in the community looking out for them that they could connect with and talk to about what was going on in their life. So these were the population that were using drugs and alcohol or addictions or cutting or crime or whatever. They're angry at society, finding ways to cope, numb out, escape their trauma that they've lived with probably all their lives, most of them, living on the streets, open to being sexually exploited. So all of those things coming together that separates them out from the at-risk population. So we'd estimate there was 2 to 250 perhaps of those youth in the children's services system, but then there's a lot more just in the community, and it's hard to quantify that and know what's going on in their life and if they would kind of fit that criteria of high-risk youth. But the community agencies will say, yeah, there's lots out. They're currently seeing an uptick in unhoused youth through COVID and through some changes in children's services, that they're seeing those numbers go up. As people recognize COVID was a tough time. And for some of those youth, when they couldn't see their supports, there was a higher rate of returning to old coping patterns, so getting involved in their addictions again, perhaps, not having people to reach out to. So there was a problem with the opioid crisis, fentanyl crisis, that there were ODs and a number of youth lost their lives in that time. And in a divided society, there's still lots going on, and housing's a big issue, and it impacts the youth. It's not just an adult problem. It can start very young for these youth.
My mom was actually a social worker, and it is a tough gig. Like, we use really nice language like child welfare, but doing an apprehension is just a terrible thing to have to do to a family, regardless of what the circumstances are. And so you obviously did it for a very long time. Is there things that you think, well, I wish I could have done that? Because I felt like my mom was constantly breaking rules to lead to success. Like, I don't remember a Christmas that we didn't have a kid come from a group home and stay with us, or several, but she shouldn't have been doing that, but she wanted them to feel love on that day, because that was her sense. So I wonder if you sort of can talk about some of the rules maybe you either broke or feel like we got to scrap this one, because it's keeping us from helping these kids that really need a system help.
Yes. A few years into working with children's services, it was a struggle. Working in a system, a bureaucratic system that was very risk management, lots of rules, lots of policies, legislation that has to be followed, and that was tough. And so there was a period of time I thought I either have to leave or make this work, and started to push the system to see how much it would bend. And to my surprise, it bent more than I anticipated it would. And there were also some good, caring people that I connected within the system, managers and supervisors that were helpful. And so, I did push the envelope.
Can you give an example, Peter, of that's where you would have pushed to see change?
It would be... think of an example. Just in the amount of time spent with the youth.
You scheduled time, limited amount of time, and you had to sort of try to find ways to add to that.
Well, I can't make the system work because there's a heavy administrative piece as well. But I think if we're not doing the face-to-face work, if we're not making the connections and building relationships, then you question, what's the end goal to here? Is it to push kind of families, children, youth families through the system or help make a difference. I mean, think back to why we got into this in the first place. What was the purpose? Nobody shows up at the office goes into social work or child and youth care and wants to sit at a computer, wants to tell kids what to do, wants to threaten family to take them to court or apprehend their kids. Yeah, yet we ended up in some of those things. So it was challenging some of those systems. Children's services should be out in the community. We should be building relationship with other communities, with people in the community, getting to know the youth on their turf, and kind of get out of the office and doing the direct work with the youth and the families.
I love that. I think. Yeah, I think that would be ideal, because social workers, police, fire, they show up once there's a problem. Right. They're not part of ensuring that child is safe all the time. They are showing up when that child's no longer safe, or when there's an issue in the household. And if you're in the community, I think you know who is struggling, what they're struggling with before you're showing up with a police officer to take their kid away. So yeah I think that to me really resonates. And then that our systems sort of pretend like they're not part of the community. They stay back, but they are. You live in these neighborhoods, but you don't have the opportunity to sort of invest that time and energy into the neighborhood until there's a problem.
Right. And a lot of fear around children's services and being an authority, which had the good fortune to be working in a couple of community projects, working out of a school, working out of Boyle Street Community Services in Bissell Centre at the time. And in the inner city, we refer to as the kid snatchers. But if you're present and you're engaging and building relationships, that starts to go away. And even community workers who the mindset of their work is to protect their families from the system, but we were working with them so they could bridge that gap and say, no, we know these people, we think they're okay, and then we could work together. But you can't. You have to be in the community to do that. And like you said, with youth, very common to hear a youth will say, I only see my worker when I'm screwing up, right? So it's hard to build relationship that way.
So I always remember when I first started at the Edmonton Journal, I was on a cop beat and saw things that I'd never seen before, met people I would have never met. And I sort of described this as the other side of the curtain, that a lot of us in our privileged lives don't have to see that. And you were on the other side of the curtain a lot. And so I'm hoping you can explain, maybe not an individual case, but like what happened to these kids that they ended up at risk or high risk for criminal offending, or probably suicide, or addiction, homelessness, all this stuff. Like, how did that happen?
Yes, a lot of the youth we work with, so they don't just appear as high-risk youth. Right? It's not one day they're a high-risk youth. It's where they come from, as you say. Often for this population, the trauma started before they were born, possibly with trauma. There've been a lot of intergenerational trauma. It's about 70% of our youth are Indigenous, right? And 69% of children in care are Indigenous, so it's not a surprise. So we know the multi-generational trauma because of colonialism, residential schools, the 60s scoop. That's very real. Not all the youth know of that experience that they came from, but they're impacted by it. And certainly not a mother-blaming thing. But if the mothers are in a stressful situation themselves, living in poverty, being surrounded by drugs, alcohol, domestic violence, that has an impact. That starts to impact the brain of the babies before they're born. So we talk about them being born into chaos. They live in chaos. They grow up in chaos. They may be taken into care by children's services, which is more chaos. They're in and out of placements, more chaos, and they're becoming adults in chaos. So this how this trauma impacts on their brain. So they're growing up with a brain that's wired to their experiences. So if their experiences are nurturing, they have a need. The need gets responded to. They regulate. It's predictable. These are not kids that have had those experiences quite often. They're kids that are hungry, need to be changed, and nobody's responding to their needs. There's abuse, they're surrounded by violence, whatever the case is, and the brain is going to wire to that experience. So it's not the moral failings of kids that we have this population, now they're a teenager and they're not coping well and they're dysregulated. That's the way their brain has been shaped by their experience. So we know by the time they're a teenager, they're well practiced at not trusting, keeping people at emotional difference, building those walls around themselves, pushing people away, and finding their own ways to cope, which is often through addictions. Trying to make that chaos in their head go away, trying to numb out from their traumatic experiences. But the challenge is the very thing they need to make a shift in their lives, they're pushing away and fighting, which is making connections and building relationships with people. So I think some of the way we've intervened is we get to know a youth and they engage in a testing behavior. Right? Are you going to stick around?
This is a social worker. You get to know this. You try to get to know this youth, and they'll push you away.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry. Yes. You were starting to explain it.
So, because it's very threatening for them to have somebody coming into their life and then risking more rejection and abandonment, and this is just indebted to the youth. I won't qualify this because this is stuff I've learned directly from them in my experience. But to get them to a point if they take the risk of allowing us into their life, so they go through this testing behavior. To see if we're going to be there, we're going to hang out with them, or hang in there with them. Are we going to be the next just to come into their lives, make a bunch of demands of them, and then leave again without even saying goodbye? Because that's been their experience. So, in a punishment mentality, which is shifted a little as we learn more about what trauma-informed practice, trauma-informed care is, but we go through this testing phase and tend to see the youth as defiant and resistant and uncooperative. And then because we have the authority, we can determine whether they're worthy of getting the help and the services they need. But what we're not understanding is the resilience of that testing behavior. Like, why wouldn't you test somebody who is telling you they want to be involved in your life? That just makes sense. That's rational. To expect the youth just to trust and follow along with the plan that you've made for them, that's the irrational part of it. And that doesn't make sense. But without understanding that, then we're just the next person that comes into their life and then leaves again. So we got to work through that and start having the youth question, why is this person hanging around? Why is this person different? What's going on? And I can't make sense of this concept of creating a healthy confusion for them. So they start to question and then start to take risks. And then if they take the risk of allowing us into their world, that's really significant, given the history of experiences that they've had.
Can you talk about a case where you got tested and then were able to get past that, like a specific, like some specifics around how you got tested? Yeah,
had lots of that. One in particular was exhausting and very, very frustrating. A 16-year-old youth that was brought into care, raised in care, had been abused in care, so trusted nobody. So I came onto the scene, and I was the next effing worker that's going to waste her time. And every time we got together subsequently, which is frequently at the beginning. It was, you're useless, you can't do anything for me, get out of my life. With a bit frostier language in that. But this went on, we were like three to 4 months in. And I would think, I'm going to be seeing, let's call her Sarah, going to be seeing Sarah today, and say, I don't want to see Sarah today. It's just abuse every time. But I can understand. There was good justification why she was doing that.
So she's abusing you.
Yes.
Okay.
Verbally abusing me. Yeah. And so it was just difficult. But I tried to keep at it to get it to the point that she could say, okay, this guy should have been gone by now. What's going on? And then about 3-4 months in, I took a risk. I didn't know how she was going to respond. But I think I built up enough credibility because I kept showing up. And I said, she was under permanent guardianship, so she had to work with that. And said, I have a sense of why it's difficult for you to accept that I'm involved in your life when given the experiences you've had. And then it was, I push people away. That's my safe zone. And lots of tears, and kind of that was a bit of the breakthrough of understanding and not punishing her for the way she was acting, but being part of that process and just working through it. So it took a long time, and like I said, it was very challenging to do that, but it paid off in the end, and we developed quite a strong relationship. And so hear from her once in a while. She's now in her 30s. But that was probably an extreme example, but it's not unusual to go through some version of that. And I think we have to. But the reason I like it is the concept of the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. Because she was putting so much energy into the relationship that... let's play with that, wait it out, and there can be a lot of good that comes with that. And the more resistant they tend to be up front, the stronger the relationship we build once we get through that.
It's an interesting, like Sarah's an interesting example in that, she was in a system that was making her act a certain way, had taught her to act that way, and then there's a breakthrough through your practice, not doing what I think that the child welfare system is designed to do, which I think, and this is, you can correct me in this, but it's designed to keep kids safe, mostly from their parents or their parents' household, and safe physically. In this case, it didn't work, but for the most part, keeps kids safe. But I think there's a lot of those unintended consequences when all you're trying to do, or all you're concerned about, or the legislation is concerned about, is keeping kids safe. So I'm wondering what the child welfare system should actually be designed to do. The example that I use a lot, and it's provocative, but there's a degree of truth in it, is the child welfare system is designed to keep kids safe, but it's also very good at creating homeless 19-year-olds.
Yes, it is.
And so how do you change this system so that it's designed to create, thriving 19-year-olds? Yeah.
It's challenging. I think, just going back to the question of challenging the system, it was to expand what risk and safety mean. Like, it's not just from their families of origin. They're struggling with their own problems typically, but it's to also protect them from being unhoused, from addictions, from violence that they're running into as well. And that's I think that's critical, because that can be seen as a separate issue. And it's not. And again, it's thinking to what our end goal is with these youth. What do we want for them? Would we not want them to be better functioning, getting something out of life, having good experiences, having some good memories out of life, having people that they understand actually care about them, that they're not so isolated? I mean, this population is a very excluded, marginalized group in society, and I Dr. Bruce Perry would say, a neuroscientist, we do a lot of things that push kids away when we should be pulling them in. And I think the system at times, and agency too, will design programs that work good for the system, but they don't necessarily work good for who we're serving. But we want them to feel engaged in society. If you want, we can create violent kids. We can deny them service. We can tell them they're a problem. We can try and punish them into compliance. And we can alienate them and make them really angry at society, and nobody cares about them. But we can do the opposite as well. We can make them feel like somebody actually does care about them, that they don't have to keep pushing people away. But we have to make time to do that. And sometimes you'll hear, well, that's not our mandate. And say, well, why isn't it our mandate? With child protection, we want them to be enjoying life, being part of society, contributing to society. And then we bring kids into the system because they've experienced rejection and abandonment. And then at the other end, we exit kids in a way they feel rejected and abandoned by the system. Because the system, for a lot of these kids, we are their guardian. And there's lots and lots of research around how youth feel let down by the system because there wasn't a good exit strategy. They just felt cut off. They felt, for some of the youth, that they lost their family, their government family, their agency people, their support network. And we're not even good at saying goodbye to kids. One youth that had eight workers in a year, and I asked there was a person from an agency who was providing independent living services and said, how many of those 7 workers said goodbye to that youth? None of them had, right? So he was super angry, didn't want to share his story anymore, didn't want to be talking to social workers or key workers or whoever. And he had a right to that. That makes sense. So we do these things that are not neutral, they're actually harmful to kids or to the youth. And they're leaving the system as angry adults, right? And then we're perpetuating the system. They're having their own kids. Perhaps Children's Services is getting involved as well. Though a lot of youth have done really well with their own kids. They want to go to school, but they don't have the resources. Advancing Future helps, but it's a lot to work with inflation and trying to survive in today's economy. But there's so much more that we could be doing. But then the government reduced the age from 24 down to 22. They created a program that transition to adult program without consulting the youth, without consulting the front line. So they're doing things, and like I say, they're not neutral. They can be harmful for these youth.
I remember writing a piece years ago, and there was a quote from Socrates or Plato or something. I can't remember which one, and the quote was one of denigrating Plato or Socrates, the emerging generation, and that they were rude and uncouth and didn't respect their elders. And, I've thought about that a lot over the years and how there is, I think, a generational bias. And I don't know if that's reflected in our models of children's services, youth in care, that sort of thing, or if we still have a hangover from this, the idea that, you gotta punish a kid. You gotta teach him lessons. That's the way you do it. Any thoughts?
Yeah, because I think child welfare came out of a punishment mentality, and to a large degree, it's still there. The High Risk Youth Initiative, we tried to shift away from that on the belief that if you want to engage youth, punishing them into compliance is an odd way to do it. And I think that population of youth, with all their trauma and their attachment issues, it's not that they can step back and say, what can I learn from this experience? For them, it's just more rejection, abandonment. Right there. And that's the way they perceive it, because that's been their experience. That's the way their brain's wired. And then we put a lot of expectations. I think that, you're 18 now, the societal attitude, you got to be independent. You got to be doing these things. We know that a lot of youth with a lot of protective factors have good families, are staying at home well into their 20s. They have a lot of support well into their 20s and beyond. And yet these youth that have had no role modeling, don't have the healthy families, the expectations we place on them at 18 to somehow magically have figured out what they want, what they need, and then they have all these strategies, and now they're just going to go and carry this out. It's just bizarre. And I do think that attitude comes out. And I think this new TAP program reinforces that. Because some of the support that was there previously is now not there, and there's more responsibility for the youth to take their own initiative. But some of them they're not even connected to people. They don't feel supported. And what we're asking for them is a lot, right? In a very complicated society now, with having come through COVID and the opioid crisis, youth struggling, trans youth, for example, who are overrepresented in suicide attempts, suicide in general, mental health, addictions, big backlash now towards those youth. It's now harder for them to feel safe in society. So, it's more complicated. I get, it's always that, the next generation, they're not as responsible as we were. It's just much more complicated than when I started 30 years ago. It's much more complicated for the youth now.
Like, very clearly, you've got some answers about what the child welfare system needs to do differently. The big question is going to be, why is it not happening? But before you get into that, I think the thing that I keep hearing is the state has decided that parents can't parent their children. So now you're a ward of the state, or the state's your guardian. And like, I recently became a father, and I don't know how good I am, but I put a lot of energy and effort into it, and I'm going to be there until the day I die. But the state is saying, we're going to keep you alive till you're 18, and then you have to execute a plan you're not capable of executing. And I'm wondering, knowing that we're setting these kids up to fail, especially those at-risk youth, what's stopping us from changing the system to be more like the one that's going to help these kids be successful in our communities? It's a good question. I don't know. I mean, if you take the compassion piece out of it and just, these kids are costing us a lot of money and stuff, the social return on investment of having healthy young adults in society is it's hard even to quantify. I mean, less costs around mental health, physical health, education, children's services getting re-involved, social assistance, aid, whatever it is. There's such a return on investment, and it's just basic decency to want youth to be thriving in society instead of struggling day to day and not knowing if they're going to find a place to live or make ends meet or have a meal. So it's something I talk with colleagues about and think about myself. What is stopping us? I don't know. We just need to change our mentality about who these kids are and what our role is in their life. We just need to look at them differently, not as numbers, but as, we want this child to thrive, and what is that going to take? And again, like, as a parent, I would want to do everything I can for my child to thrive. And as a taxpayer, I would hope the state, when they decide that they're going to become guardians for a child, maybe my child one day, I would hope they would put that same energy and effort into ensuring that she's going to be successful in life.
Yeah, I would hope. I would hope as well. And, we have the capacity. There's a lot of caring workers in the system that want to do better, that they talk about why they got into this work, that they want to be helping, and are very frustrated that they can't do that to the degree they want.
So, Peter, I wanted to ask you, you did use your journalism training at some point, yes?
Yeah.
And you've written a book. Please tell us about it.
Yeah, thanks. The title of the book is Working with High-Risk Youth, a Relationship-Based Practice. First edition came out in 2017, and second edition that I've been working on will be coming out in early December. And a few editions around touching on some of these areas. How do we transition youth better? How do we say a proper goodbye to this youth when we're leaving? And yeah, just in enhancing, because I've learned things since the first edition came out, and I have the privilege of using it in a course I teach about working with high-risk youth, and I've enjoyed that as well. So yeah, but
Where are you teaching?
At McEwan University in the social work program there.
Well, and is the book a layman pick it up and enjoy it, understand it, or is it more for a professional audience?
I think it's accessible, and that was where some of the journalism training was helpful. That I didn't want it to be just purely academic.
Yeah,
and it is to a degree, but it's stories about youth, and I'm more conversational about some of the concepts in the book, about the trauma, about making connections with the youth. So
where can people get it?
Through the publisher Routledge Taylor Francis Group, or through Amazon.
Is there any at Audrey's?
No,
you could order through Audrey's. Yeah,
yeah. So I would.
We'll put some links on the website so that people can find it.
Yeah,
exactly.
That'd be great. Thanks,
Peter. It's really good to see you. Really quick story. We, the journalism students, beat the law enforcement students that year in football. And you can imagine the law enforcement students are all big, tall, athletic types, and we're sort of pencil-necked geeks. And we beat them largely because of Peter Smyth's right foot, because he kicked field goals for us. So Peter has always been in that big day in my life, winning that game. Peter's a huge part of that story.
Yeah, iconic day that was.
Thanks, Peter.
Yeah, thanks very much. Good to be here.